Muchas gracias por su presencia. Estamos en la presentación del reporte especial de la Agencia Internacional de Energía respecto del panorama energético de México. Este es un documento que se elabora año con año respecto de todo el mundo, con las estadísticas más relevantes del sector energético a nivel global. Este año la Agencia Internacional de Energía distingue a nuestro país con un reporte especial. Iniciamos dándole la bienvenida al honorable Presidium, encabezado por el secretario Pedro Joaquín Codwell. También nos acompaña el doctor Fatih Birol, director ejecutivo de la Agencia Internacional de Energía. El comisionado presidente de la Comisión Reguladora de Energía y anfitrión de este evento, Guillermo García. Y Tim Gould, el encargado de este reporte. A continuación, el secretario nos dará unas palabras.
Quiero, en primer término, expresar mi agradecimiento a la Comisión Reguladora de Energía por nos brinda la hospitalidad de estas modernas y espléndidas oficinas para llevar a cabo este evento de presentación del reporte especial para México de la Agencia Internacional de Energía. Me complace mucho darle la bienvenida a nuestro país al señor Fatih Birol, director ejecutivo de la Agencia Internacional de Energía, y a la delegación que le acompaña. Saludo de manera especial al presidente de la Comisión Reguladora, Guillermo García Alcocer, así como a la señora y a los señores comisionados que nos acompañan. Me siento muy honrado como titular de la Secretaría de Energía porque la Agencia Internacional de Energía haya seleccionado a México para elaborar y publicar este informe especial del sector. Celebro el interés y el valioso acompañamiento de la agencia en la reforma eléctrica mexicana desde que comenzó a diseñarse en 2012 y a lo largo del proceso de implementación que inició hace 2 años aproximadamente. En este lapso de tiempo, las industrias de hidrocarburos y electricidad de nuestro país han transitado por una transformación profunda e integral. Una auténtica revolución energética, como en algún momento la calificó el señor Fatih Birol. México cuenta hoy con un nuevo paradigma en materia de energía, con reglas claras, con instituciones fuertes, con empresas públicas que pueden asociarse y con privadas que están contribuyendo a la generación de empleos a lo largo del país. En estos últimos 24 meses, la tarea de las autoridades del sector ha sido propiciar la formación de instituciones y mercados en prácticamente todas las actividades de hidrocarburos y electricidad, en donde las empresas públicas y las privadas ya están compitiendo en igualdad de condiciones bajo la rectoría del Estado. En exploración y extracción de hidrocarburos, concluimos 3 licitaciones y están en marcha otras 3 para adjudicar contratos de exploración y producción en aguas someras, en campos terrestres y en aguas profundas. De las 44 áreas contractuales que licitamos en las primeras 3 convocatorias, logramos adjudicar 30 contratos a 37 empresas de 8 países que invertirán $7,000 millones a lo largo de la vida de los contratos. Además, el porcentaje de utilidad promedio para el Estado es del 60%, lo que permitirá al país contar con recursos para continuar invirtiendo en proyectos sociales. Estos resultados son alentadores y dan cuenta del potencial de México como productor de crudo, incluso en el entorno actual de disminución de los precios internacionales. Los precios de exportación de la mezcla mexicana se están manteniendo por encima de los $35 por barril, mientras que el promedio del costo de extracción en el territorio nacional es de casi $16, lo cual sigue siendo atractivo para los inversionistas. Esperamos que las 3 licitaciones que están en curso sean igual de exitosas que las anteriores. Estamos ya a mes y medio de que la Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos realice el acto de fallo de la licitación de 10 áreas contractuales en aguas profundas y ultraprofundas, en la que tenemos inscritas 26 petroleras de gran escala a nivel mundial. De igual modo, el próximo 5 de diciembre, la CNH dará a conocer cuáles, entre las 10 empresas registradas, serán los socios de Pemex en el campo Trión. Será un hecho relevante para nuestra petrolera nacional, que durante décadas tuvo vedada la posibilidad de asociarse y compartir riesgos. La implementación de la reforma mantendrá el dinamismo alcanzado hasta ahora. El próximo año concluiremos la primera y segunda licitación de la Ronda 2, en la que se concursarán 15 contratos de producción compartida en aguas someras y 12 de licencia en áreas terrestres. En el caso específico de esta Ronda 2.2, el objetivo de la política energética es extraer gas seco y gas húmedo, que son valiosos insumos para la industria petroquímica. En Midstream tenemos el objetivo de crear y consolidar mercados competitivos, tanto en gas natural como en gas LP, en gasolinas y en diésel. Para ello requerimos abrir estos sectores a la competencia, garantizar el acceso a la infraestructura existente y propiciar la construcción de nuevas terminales de almacenamiento, ductos y el desarrollo de otros medios de transporte de combustible. Actualmente estamos en un proceso de retroalimentación con la industria para afinar la política pública para la implementación del mercado de gas natural. La finalidad es que para 2018 los precios se determinen de acuerdo a la oferta y la demanda de cada región. Para garantizar el acceso a los gasoductos, el Centro Nacional de Control de Gas Natural, CENAGAS, anunció hoy, hace unos momentos, el inicio de la primera temporada abierta en la que empresas privadas concursarán para reservar capacidad en los 9,000 kilómetros de ductos que Pemex le transfirió al CENAGAS en enero de este año. Con ello se maximizará el aprovechamiento de la infraestructura existente. La reforma energética también abrió los permisos de importación de petrolíferos y varias compañías han mostrado interés en participar con nuevos proyectos en este ámbito. Recientemente, la Comisión Reguladora de Energía concluyó la primera temporada abierta para la construcción del primer poliducto con recursos privados que se construirá en México y que unirá Corpus Christi, Texas, con la zona metropolitana de Monterrey. En Downstream también se están generando mercados. El de gas LP está por liberalizarse el año siguiente y está en proceso de liberalizar la venta al público de gasolinas. En materia eléctrica tenemos funcionando el mercado de largo y de corto plazo. El primero se encuentra en proceso de maduración y actualmente participan compañías, 3 privadas y la Compañía Eléctrica Nacional, que representa también a 200 permisionarios. Además, 20 empresas más están en proceso de incorporarse. Por su parte, en el mercado eléctrico de largo plazo, estamos teniendo resultados muy promisorios que contribuyen a alcanzar las metas que la Agencia Internacional de Energía ha planteado para mitigar el cambio climático y transitar hacia combustibles más amigables con el medio ambiente. Este año México realizó 2 subastas de energías limpias, que destacaron por obtener precios altamente competitivos a nivel mundial. La nueva capacidad solar y eólica a instalar en las 2 subastas representa el 170% de lo construido en los últimos 18 años. Es decir, nuestro país está triplicando su capacidad, particularmente solar y eólica. Estos avances a los que me he referido forman parte de la estrategia que el gobierno mexicano se ha propuesto para resolver algunos de los desafíos en materia de energía. Recordemos que el aislamiento que impuso el régimen jurídico previo a la reforma energética limitó el desarrollo y la modernización de nuestras industrias de los hidrocarburos y la electricidad. El reto actual es que cada una de las fases de la implementación de la reforma energética continúe avanzando a buen ritmo. El informe especial sobre México, que la Agencia Internacional de Energía nos da a conocer el día de hoy, nos alienta a continuar por el camino que nos hemos trazado y a redoblar nuestros esfuerzos para llevar la reforma energética a buen puerto. En su análisis, la agencia nos transporta al México del futuro y nos relata cómo evolucionará el rostro energético nacional. De acuerdo con sus previsiones y como consecuencia de la reforma energética, para el año 2040 nuestro país será más sustentable. Habrá superado la meta de que el 35% de nuestra electricidad provenga de energías limpias. Habrá incrementado la producción de crudo y reducido la importación de petrolíferos. Además, las normas de eficiencia energética habrán logrado disminuir notablemente nuestro consumo de energía. Coincido con la agencia en que estos últimos 2 años en materia de energía tendrán un impacto significativo en el porvenir del país en el mediano y largo plazo, pues definirán la disponibilidad en energéticos y los patrones de consumo de las generaciones del mañana. El desafío que los mexicanos tenemos hoy es volver realidad las predicciones positivas que nos presenta la Agencia Internacional de Energía. Un capítulo muy interesante de este reporte es la prospectiva que la agencia realiza en un escenario en el que no se hubiera realizado la reforma energética. Sin reforma, la producción de petróleo en 2040 se ubicaría en 1 millón de barriles diarios menos que en el escenario con reforma. Sin reforma, los costos de electricidad en 2040 serían más altos y el subsidio sumaría 1.350 millones de dólares. Sin reforma, en 2040 México se ubicaría muy por debajo de las metas de generación limpia. Sin reforma, en 2040 la economía de México sería 4% menor. En contraste, la proyección para el escenario con reforma energética, el escenario actual, es que las ganancias acumuladas en el Producto Interno Bruto por la reforma energética para 2040 podrían ascender a 1 millón de millones de dólares, beneficio ausente en el escenario sin reforma energética. Las inversiones que se requieren para cumplir con los supuestos y alcanzar el escenario exitoso son 240,000 millones de dólares en electricidad, 640,000 millones de dólares aguas arriba y 130,000 en eficiencia energética. Señoras y señores, la reforma energética mexicana está generando resultados tangibles y está logrando reposicionar a nuestro país en el escenario internacional. Para México es fundamental ser parte del diálogo mundial que se suscita al interior de la Agencia Internacional de Energía, ya que este organismo marca la pauta en las tareas globales de promover la seguridad energética, el desarrollo económico, la sustentabilidad y la interacción global entre actores y especialistas del mayor reconocimiento y prestigio en el sector. Hace casi un año, en el marco de la pasada reunión ministerial de la Agencia Internacional de Energía, México solicitó oficialmente su adhesión para integrarse como miembro pleno a este organismo. A lo largo de este tiempo, los equipos de trabajo de la agencia y de la Secretaría de Energía y los órganos reguladores del sector han realizado numerosas tareas de evaluación técnica para revisar el marco regulatorio y la política energética de nuestro país. En los meses por venir, estas visitas de seguimiento técnico continuarán, en las que se examinará que nuestros sistemas de información y los mecanismos de respuesta ante las emergencias cumplan los más altos estándares internacionales del sector. Expreso mi más sincero reconocimiento al señor Fatih Birol por su liderazgo al frente de la Agencia Internacional de Energía, por su interés en difundir en el mundo la experiencia mexicana y por apoyarnos en el proceso de implementación. Tenemos la confianza en que con la profunda transformación que se está logrando con la reforma energética, México estará a la altura de los requerimientos de este prestigiado organismo internacional. Muchas gracias.
En este momento, el director ejecutivo de la agencia, Fatih Birol, nos hará favor de presentar los principales hallazgos del reporte especial sobre México del World Energy Outlook.
Secretary Joachim Caldwell, thank you very much for this excellent and kind introduction. President Commissioner Garcia, Alcocer, representative of different distinguished parts of the Mexican energy sector, business and academic communities, excellencies, and members of the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be with you here today and to launch our report, Mexican Energy Outlook. Some of you may heard of, and I hope so, World Energy Outlook. This is the Bible of the global energy scene. And every year, this report focuses on a very important country. Last year, we released the report on India, which I personally presented to Prime Minister Modi. And next year, we are going to focus on China. And this year, we are focusing on a great country, Mexico. If I may, Mr. Secretary, I want to tell a bit, before going to Outlook, a bit on the past. How did I decide to make this Mexican Energy Outlook, and why did I decide that? January 2015, Davos. Some of you may know I am at the same time the chairman of the World Economic Forum Davos in terms of energy, and there was a session on Mexico energy reforms. I went to that session, and I should be honest that I was not very well informed about the Mexican energy reforms, and I have not yet met Mr. Secretary. There were several ministers, prime ministers, executives of a small, in fact, perhaps 50, 60 people, and I was one of them. And I started to listen, Mr. Secretary. In a very tranquil way, step by step, he explained the dimensions, the scope, and the depth of the reforms. Before working for the IEA, at that time I was the chief economist of the IEA, I worked several years at the OPEC Secretariat in Vienna. I have followed many countries' reforms or reform attempts. Producing countries, consuming countries, developing countries, developed countries. I have never seen a reform program which has such a huge dimension in terms of breadth and depth. Therefore, I thought, this is not a reform. This is a revolution happening in this country. So, in fact, the applause goes to Mr. Secretary. And it was not only me who was impressed by that speech. It was almost everybody. And afterwards, I had the pleasure, right after that, to meet Mr. Secretary and learned one more important information. Because when I talk with somebody at the end of the day, it always ends up talking about football. And he was a supporter of Pumas, and I am a supporter of Galatasaray. So this is the second important information I learned from them. And after that, we had the opportunity to discuss several times, and I had the pleasure to know Mr. Secretary. Second time I met Mr. Secretary, 2015 of May, when I came here and told Mr. Secretary, would Mexico be interested that we look at the Mexican reforms in the long term? What are the implications and what are the challenges for the country? And Mr. Secretary gave a strong endorsement, and we have started the work, and we built a huge team at the IEA to work on this very important challenge. Third time I met Mr. Secretary, I will not go too many times, only 5 times. Third time I met Mr. Secretary was in November 2015. And at that time, as Mr. Secretary mentioned, we had our ministerial meeting, which was chaired by the Secretary Moniz of the US government. And Mr. Secretary, as he just mentioned, officially submitted the request of Mexico being a member of the IEA. It was one of the happiest days of my professional life, I can say, because at that very meeting, it was 2 months after I took over the IEA's helm, I told the entire ministers, entire world, my main strategy as the new head of the IEA is opening the doors of the IEA to emerging countries. And I don't want to be named IEA as the rich man's energy club. We should be the organization of all the countries of the world, and having Mexico on board will definitely help that. And since then, after Mexico, we have worked with many other emerging countries in different forms, but Mexico definitely is very important, especially as a major oil-producing country. We have many oil-producing countries as members: United States, Canada, Norway, another big producer, Australia. In fact, I mentioned OPEC. Last week, I was in a session with the OPEC Secretary General, and I told them, with OPEC and the IEA, the divides are over. because IEA is known by some, which is completely wrong, as the consumers organization, and OPEC is a producer organization. Let me give you one number. In the last 5 years, oil production growth in the IEA countries was 3 times higher than the OPEC countries. 3 times higher. IEA countries' oil production growth. And oil consumption growth in the OPEC countries was 5 times higher than the IEA countries. So we have to leave this schablon, these schemes behind us, and therefore it will be great to have Mexico with us as a modern country with huge ambitions. So we are very much hoping that next year Mexico becomes a full member of the IEA, and as Mr. Secretary, I am doing my best to facilitate this process in a short period of time. Now, this is the 5th time that I have the honor to meet Mr. Secretary, and I promised him this report. I promised my member countries, I promised the entire world this report, and we are here. Why this report is important? Because of the results, and not only for Mexico, but as I have seen in that very meeting in Davos, many countries who are in the process of implementing or planning a reform are looking at Mexico. Mexico, with good results, can be a source of inspiration for many countries in this very region and in the entire world. So therefore, I did deliver today what I promised Mr. Secretary, and I hope that the next delivery will be in November, at least November 2017, to have Mexico as a full member of the IEA. This report, which we released today, and it is about to be released to the international press in a couple of minutes, is an effort of many colleagues in the IEA, different experts coming from the different parts of the IEA, but also working closely with Mexican government, academia, NGOs, businesses, getting everything together as an objective analysis. You will see that not every number we have here is exactly in line with the government's numbers, projections, but they are all in the same direction. And one important, perhaps the main result of our report is to carry out reforms was not an option for the country. And we look at it in a quantitative way, lots of data, lots of time, lots of efforts, information went into that. My colleague Tim Gould carried out the work with several colleagues from the IEA, and I want to say Rodolfo, a big help to us, Mr. Shirayi, Mr. Ali Safa, and Mr. Husar, some of them are here, and many of them in Paris, listening us, watching us live here, made a strong contribution. More than 100 people peer-reviewed the results. Before passing the floor to my colleague, Mr. Gould, let me tell you that we have seen a lot of signs that show that period reform pathway is not sustainable, and energy reforms were crucial. And this is, you will see in our report, this is proven from oil to electricity, from economy to the environmental issues. Because the oil production declined more than 1 million barrels per day, so did the revenues and the trade reverse. And this is between 2004 and today. 1 million barrels per day in 10 years of time, with all implications on the economy. We have seen several inefficiencies across the electricity sector, from the losses to the inefficiencies in the generation. In terms of the share of oil, for example, many of you know much better than me, the share of oil in the power generation, and my friend Aldo will know that very well. In Middle East, major single product economies, the share of oil in electricity generation is lower than that of in Mexico. So this is very important. In Middle East, single product economies, the share of oil there in electricity generation is lower than in Mexico. So there is a lot of ground to cover there, and a huge portion of the renewable potential, great renewable potential of the renewables remain untapped. So therefore, a vision of a more productive, efficient, and clean energy sector was very welcome. And we have seen already steps in terms of the constitutional, legal, and regulatory changes. And this has opened to attract investment. Now, if somebody asks me, I am not an expert in Mexico. I look at all the countries. What are the three most important things that Mexico needs in the energy sector? There are many things, of course. You can give me a long list. But three things that Mexico needs for me is investment, investment, and investment again. This is the main thing. And our report shows that Mexico needs, on average, each year, $40 billion investment to mobilize. $40 billion each year for power plants, pipelines, oil production, etc. And this is not easy. And these reforms open the way to mobilize that investment. As such, they are much welcome. And also, we see that Mexico took over the leadership on climate change and environmental issues. In terms of climate law, in terms of being one of the first countries putting the pledges, nation-determined contributions, playing a key role in the historic Paris agreements. The image of Mexico in the international community has been much different compared to previous years in that very context. We should also highlight the very fact that in terms of the environmental local pollution, we have seen considerable improvements as a result of the regulatory measures taken here. Now, this all happens in a lower oil and gas price environment. So you don't choose the time of the reform according to the prices. You go ahead, you go frontal. If the government, if the country needs it, if you feel the historical responsibility, political responsibility to push the reforms. And lower oil prices, of course, created significant challenges for the reform process. But on the other hand, it also provides an opportunity to get some discipline, increase the productivity, and provide more flexibility in terms of the next steps to be taken in the oil sector. In terms of natural gas, we have seen that the lower gas prices this time was beneficial for the country by making use of the US shale gas. Before coming here, I checked the prices. Mexican gas from United States, we have many ambassadors from Europe here. European import price from Russia, I can tell you, the Mexico import prices from US is much more reasonable compared to Europeans are experiencing in terms of the prices. And you can ask the Europeans, it is not the higher price they experience in their business with Russia in terms of gas. Now, I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Mr. Tim Gould. But before finishing that, my introductory notes, I wanted to tell you that we did two things. One, we look at the future of Mexico with the reforms. How does it look like? Oil, gas, electricity, renewables, countries changing, modernizing. But we did one more thing. How would the Mexican energy sector economy would look like if there was no reforms? Why did we do that? Because we see that some people across the world are not yet fully convinced that the reforms were necessary. Our numbers are a very strong answer to those who put some weak, in my view, question marks next to the reform attempts. My colleague, Mr. Gould, will tell you a couple of things, but I can quote you one number. Mexico's economy in the next 25 years is at least $1 trillion better off compared to a Mexico which did not realize these reforms. $1 trillion, in addition to have a much more modern, much more reliable, much more sustainable energy sector. So now I would like to invite my colleague, Mr. Gould, to give you some of the details, very interesting details of the report, and I would, if he allows me, I will also give a concluding remark. Tim?
Thank you very much, Dr. Burrell. Mr. Secretary, honored guests. It's never an easy task to follow Dr. Burrell, but I am going to give him the floor back again, but not before I've had the chance to talk through some of the main findings from our work. I would, though, like to echo the thanks that he provided to many of those in this room who provided advice and guidance to us throughout this project. The findings are ours, but we could not have done it without your guidance and help. But to lead into these remarks, I wanted to take a step back and look at some of the tasks facing policymakers now with the Paris Agreement only a few days before it enters into force. And the energy challenge is essentially a story of the relationship between three indicators: economic growth, energy demand, and pollutant emissions, CO2 and other pollutants. And these three have traditionally moved very closely together, shoulder to shoulder. But the task facing policymakers is, in fact, to weaken those links and to decouple the necessary economic growth from the energy required to support that growth. And then, from the energy side, to decouple the energy use from some of the environmental impacts. And there are some very encouraging signs at global level. At 2015, global CO2 emissions stalled, even though we had a period of continued global growth. And I think Mexico is a good example about why some of these trends are decoupling. So in our projections, the Mexican economy doubles in size, but energy demand increases by much less. And that has to do with some structural changes in the economy. It also has to do with the strategic focus that is put on improvements in energy efficiency. And the relationship between energy consumption and emissions is also changing. If we look back at the last 25 years, 1 unit of energy demand growth produced 1.3 units of emissions growth. If we look forward to the next 25 years with the sorts of changes that have been discussed and the increased penetration of renewables, the increased use of natural gas, 1 unit of energy demand growth is associated only with 0.3 units of CO2 growth. And the same is true for emissions in other areas. So we've mentioned already the local pollutants. There has already been a major decoupling of trends between energy and emissions of NOx, SOx, particulate matter. And as fuel combustion starts to play a less important role in the mix with the rise of renewables, so you see an acceleration, a further movement in those trends, with further large cuts in the pollutants that affect air quality. And as we shall see, the energy transition, the energy reform, is instrumental in delivering these sorts of changes. So we looked at different aspects of the energy system. I'm going to talk a little bit about the demand side, the end-use sectors. The current structure of Mexico's energy consumption is very heavily weighted towards the transport sector. So it's around 40% of final consumption, compared with an OECD average of less than 1/3. But we do see that rebalancing in the next 25 years. Rebalancing towards growth in industrial energy consumption, rebalancing towards growth in the building sector, so residential and services. And that's really a story about natural gas, and it's a story about electricity. So in the industry sector, if we look at the outlook to 2040, then we see how electricity, and in particular natural gas, can make a significant contribution to growth and competitiveness. This is not just about the availability of relatively cheap shale gas from the United States. It's also about some of the regulatory reforms that were mentioned by the Secretary, more transparent pricing, access, private participation in infrastructure and the upstream. Demand for electricity grows faster than for any other fuel, and that's led by households, rising incomes, rising ownership of appliances, and particularly a threefold increase in demand for cooling. And that raises the question about how important are demand-side measures going to be in Mexico's energy future. And we are pleased to see that there is a strong strategic focus on energy efficiency in the policy framework that we've analyzed. One of the impacts of that you can see in the transport sector. Now, the transport sector, because of its weight in final consumption, is a particularly important one. There's a major opportunity to improve the fuel efficiency of passenger vehicles. And that, together with greater penetration of hybrid vehicles, some electric cars, means that you have a 50% increase in the vehicle stock, but only a relatively marginal increase in the energy demand associated with passenger vehicles. But that's not true for heavy freight, for trucks. There, in the absence of a clear timetable for a new standard in that area, the pace of efficiency gains is that much slower. So even though trucks are a relatively small portion of final consumption in the transport sector, they account for 50% of growth to 2040. It's a difficult area for regulation, but we feel it's an increasingly necessary one. So now, to move on to the power sector, a core sector, of course, for the energy reform. This is the starting point that we have in our base year of 2014, and as was mentioned already, one of the very notable aspects of Mexico's power generation system is the still relatively high share of power generated by oil. So what happens over the period to 2040? For us, oil is relatively quickly flushed out of the power generation mix. Most of that is gone by 2020. The contribution from coal also declines as some of the existing capacity is retired. We have incorporated an additional 2 gigawatts of nuclear capacity into our projections, although even this cautious assessment would require probably some additional mechanism of support or guarantee, given the evidence of strong interest and low bids to support other forms of low-carbon electricity. But the really distinctive aspect of the reform, as has been mentioned, lies in the expansion of clean energy and the way that a very sophisticated market design has combined the operation of short-term markets with the investment security offered by long-term auctions. Now, in many of the OECD countries that we work with very closely, power market liberalization happened 10, 15 years ago. And just in the last few years, there's been an attempt to decarbonize those liberalized systems. And the interface between those liberalized systems and the decarbonization objectives has not always been smooth. So it's been to Mexico's advantage that it's been able to incorporate its clean energy obligations into the reform package from the outset. The work is not complete, but this is a framework, in our view, that can deliver some very substantial increases in generation from renewables, roughly the same as what we project from natural gas. The dominant technologies are wind and solar. And the results of the auction so far give us strong grounds for encouragement. The interest shown from the private sector suggests strong confidence in the market design, and the readiness of bidders to put in low bids to get a foothold for the market, get a foothold in the market, also suggests a strong faith in the future and a continued commitment to deploy clean energy technologies. Now, two implications of this are worth highlighting. As Dr. Burrell mentioned, this has an impact on end-user tariffs and competitiveness, especially for the qualified consumers that can buy electricity directly from the market. We see the likelihood of cost reductions in electricity supply to 2040, delivered in the near term by the switching away from oil to natural gas, but then by efficiency gains, operational efficiency, reduction in the significant network losses that you see still today. And second, you see the real prospect of achieving the clean energy targets. So the 35% clean energy target for 2024 is met in our projections, and a dramatic reduction in the carbon intensity of the power sector. The other key element of the reform, of course, is the need to turn the oil sector around. The starting point, despite the best efforts of Pemex, is one of steady decline. So production is already down from the numbers that you see here. This is total oil, so including crude and natural gas liquids. So if you look at total oil supply, we're just above 2.4 million barrels a day, so already quite a distance below the 2.6 shown for 2015 in this chart. And the key underlying issue for Mexico, as for all oil producers, is the decline anticipated from existing fields. Worldwide, these declines are the equivalent of losing Iraq, a producer the size of Iraq, from the global balance every 2 years. And as Pemex and other oil and gas colleagues well know, most of the investment that is made in the upstream is to combat decline rather than to meet increases in demand. So against this backdrop, with today's prices hovering around $50 a barrel, and given the long lead times in new projects, 3 to 6 years, it's clear that reform is unlikely to deliver a quick turnaround in the oil output trajectory. But what it can do, and what it is doing in our view, is laying the foundations for future recovery by bringing in new investment technology. So our oil output was based on a detailed asset-by-asset analysis of the blocks and prospects for development. It also has a steadily rising oil price as a backdrop. And it rests on three pillars. The first is a revival onshore, with specialized players helping to get more out of smaller fields, out of Chicontepec, as well as the anticipated start of tight oil production from the early 2020s. Second, the possibility for Pemex to form new partnerships to get the most out of its traditional stronghold and its traditional expertise, enhanced oil recovery, working in new satellite fields around the main producing complexes, and so on. And then finally, there's the deep offshore. Clear promise, but numerous technical challenges that international expertise and technology can help to resolve. These developments take more time to come to fruition, but starting with the Trion field, and then with assets that may be awarded in the upcoming bid rounds, they gain momentum in the 2020s. And the net result is a trajectory that returns to growth around the end of this decade, ensuring that Mexico retains its position as one of the world's leading producers and exporters. Before handing the floor back to Dr. Burrell, there's been a number of mentions of this no reform case, and I wanted to just explain how we put it together and what the results of that analysis are. So this is a case in which none of the reforms enacted since 2013 are in place. So Pemex retains its monopoly in the oil and gas sector, and in addition, there's no additional private participation or restructuring in the power sector. So in our main scenario, capital and technology come from multiple sources. But in the no reform case, investment is of course constrained by the budget available to Pemex, which we modeled based on the projected revenues and historical cost ratios. And the immediate problem that emerges, particularly in the next few years, is that that gets caught in a spiral of falling output and relatively low prices that severely limits the funds available for new projects. So the priority for relatively scarce capital is presumed to be the shallow water and some onshore projects, meaning that the start of more technically demanding projects in the deep water and tight oil is held back. So the starting point is the same with the decline, but all of the segments that we have analyzed in our main scenario then turn out to fall short of those numbers, particularly the deep water projects. And the effect of this lower investment is felt not just in the upstream. Refinery upgrades that are assumed to go ahead in our main scenario and which lift utilization rates back in towards the high 80s, 90%. They're also delayed, meaning that Mexico remains an important, or means more dependent on imported oil products in the no reform scenario, even as its own exports fall back. And this also has an impact on global balances. In our global outlook, Dr. Birol referred to the World Energy Outlook. We're releasing our new update on the 16th of November. As non-OPEC supply falls back in the latter part of our projection period, the world becomes increasingly reliant on key Middle East producers, notably Iran and Iraq, to meet demand for oil. And there are relatively few other non-OPEC producers that are in a position to increase substantially their production between now and 2040. Possibly the United States, probably Canada, Brazil. So growth in Mexico is an important component in any discussion about the diversity and security of global oil supply. Finally, to sum up some of the impacts that we see in a no reform case, we've talked about the impact on oil production. Oil export revenue is hit even harder as the surplus dwindles. The effects are also felt in the power sector. Fuel switching continues, but some of the other efficiency gains are not realized, meaning that the electricity price for qualified consumers is around 14% higher than it is in our main case. Without specific policies to promote clean energy, you get less money going into wind and solar, which means the clean energy targets are missed. We're around 25% in 2024 of clean energy, so quite some way short of the targeted amounts. And CO2 emissions from the power sector are that much higher as a result. And finally, there are the broader economic repercussions. These we calculated with the assistance of colleagues from the OECD. So we've coupled our world energy model with their general equilibrium model, both of which has, of course, country representation of Mexico. And the decline in investment in the upstream has knock-on effects throughout the economy, as does the shortage in fiscal revenue available to the Mexican state and the higher electricity costs that need to be covered one way or another by consumers. Household budgets and consumption are hit, and the size of the Mexican economy is more than $100 billion smaller by 2040 in a no reform case. So that's more than 4% in 2040. The cumulative impact, as Dr. Birol mentioned, adds up to more than $1 trillion. So whether seen from an energy, environmental, or economic perspective, we consider that a successful energy reform can deliver a much better outcome for Mexico. And with that, I would just pass back to Thas.
Well, just to wrap up, ladies and gentlemen, before going to the final slide, this means those who have some hesitation about the reforms implicitly say, I don't want Mexican oil production to grow. I want lower oil production. I want lower oil revenues. I want more CO2 emissions. I want less renewables. and I want a smaller Mexican economy. This is very simple. 2 times 2 is 4. This is what Tim told us. Now, to finish our presentation to you, what we found out in our work that the Reforma Energética, as Mr. Secretary calls in Spanish, and what I call in English, Mexican Energy Revolution, provides the Mexican energy sector the required tools and the targets to modernize the Mexican energy sector to boost the Mexican economic growth. There are several challenges lie ahead. Not everything is so rosy. Many challenges in front of us, ranging from raising $40 billion US each year to make it in the oil sector in a rather lower oil price environment. But we see that the early signals are positive, ranging from the what we see in the renewable sector to the bidding rounds. Lots of hope for December, in fact, more than hope, expectations for December. So we would like to see that while Pemex and CFE are strong bodies in the very country, they may perhaps focus on their own strengths, but there is a need others to compete on an equal footing in order to provide competition and make a much more productive energy sector. Climate change and environment, as I told you in the beginning, believe me, I go many countries across the world. Mexican leadership here in the very region and in the climate change front, being a pioneer is very much appreciated. And it is not only good for the image of Mexico, but it's also important for the Mexican people's health and the environment of the very country. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, no country today, no country is an energy island. What happens in one country affects the other one. Through technology, through energy prices, to international agreements, many different ways. And IEA, the Global Energy Authority, we are much more than happy to support the Mexican people, Mexican government in this ambitious but a very timely undertaking to reach the goals of these wonderful reforms. And we will be even happier to have Mexico as the 30th member of our family sometime very soon. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
A continuación, el comisionado presidente de la Comisión Reguladora de Energía hará los comentarios de México al reporte.
Muchas gracias a todos. Saludo con aprecio al secretario de Energía, al licenciado Pedro Joaquín Codwell, que nos honra con su presencia. Le doy la bienvenida a nombre de nuestros comisionados que también nos acompañan el día de hoy. Es un honor tenerlo en estas instalaciones. Saludo también a los miembros de la misión de la Agencia Internacional de Energía, encabezados por el doctor Fatih Birol. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Tenemos pleno de reguladores y de subsecretarios. Es un honor tenerlos aquí en su casa. Es verdaderamente un halago que estemos aquí. Quisiera dar la bienvenida también a los representantes de la industria que nos acompañan. Estamos también en pleno en upstream, downstream, midstream, electricidad, renovables. Todo el mundo, es una gran fiesta la que tenemos hoy en día, hoy en la CRE. Quisiera hacer, antes de hablar, un reconocimiento público y muy sentido al licenciado Fernando Cendejas, quien tuvo en su encargo la difícil coordinación de todos los actores, que tuvimos alguna participación en las reuniones con la agencia, en los diversos foros que se fueron armando y en integrar los comentarios que se hicieron a los borradores de este documento. La reforma energética 2013-2014, promovida por el presidente de la República y liderada con gran acierto por el secretario de Energía, el licenciado Pedro Joaquín Codwell, está transformando a las industrias de los hidrocarburos y la energía eléctrica en México. El reconocimiento a esta reforma energética ha traspasado fronteras. Es por ello que agradecemos la distinción que la Agencia Internacional de Energía hace a México al seleccionar a nuestra nación para la elaboración y presentación del reporte especial de este año como parte del lanzamiento del World Energy Outlook 2016. Este hecho adquiere mayor relevancia en virtud de que México ha solicitado formalmente su adición a la agencia, y esos son los trabajos que mencionaba que estamos haciendo encabezados por Fer. Hoy me gustaría dirigir a ustedes un mensaje sobre un aspecto de la reforma que destaca el reporte y que, si bien no lo dice explícitamente, creo que es el foco que debemos tener todos nosotros en esta sala. El éxito de la implementación de esta reforma en estos primeros años ha sido la confianza que se ha generado en los distintos actores de voltear a ver a México, de voltear a ver a nuestro país como un atractivo destino de la inversión. El secretario Joaquín ya expuso puntualmente el alcance y los avances que ha registrado la reforma al día de hoy. Sin lugar a dudas nos encontramos ante una transformación profunda e integral. Por su parte, el doctor Birol nos ha compartido los escenarios y visión de la agencia hacia adelante, ha calificado a la reforma como un hito histórico para México y para la energía global, con un impacto y potencia considerables. Ahora bien, ¿cómo transitamos del entorno presente altamente positivo, descrito por el secretario Joaquín, al futuro prometedor que plantea el doctor Birol? Dicho de otra manera, ¿cómo apuntalamos y materializamos los beneficios de la reforma energética? Esto solo lo lograremos a través de la confianza. En este sentido, el mayor logro de esta reforma ha sido establecer reglas claras y procesos transparentes. Ambos son los precursores fundamentales de la confianza. Las instituciones energéticas del Gobierno de la República trabajamos incansablemente para propiciar certeza e igualdad de condiciones en la implementación de la reforma. Buscamos que la industria nacional e internacional invierta su capital, detone el crecimiento económico y genere empleos en nuestro país. En este orden de ideas, la labor de la Comisión Reguladora de Energía como institución es asegurar que todas las formas de energía lleguen a la industria, comercios y hogares en las cantidades demandadas, con la calidad adecuada y a los costos más competitivos posibles. Esta no es una labor fácil. A la fecha, la CRE ha facilitado la entrada de nuevos competidores a través de la emisión de más de 15,000 permisos a las industrias del gas natural, gas LP, petrolíferos y energía eléctrica. Todo esto en tiempo récord y sin emitir un solo papel durante el proceso. En total, la emisión de permisos, que son un indicador de las inversiones que vienen hacia adelante, representan, de materializarse, una inversión proyectada superior a los 90,000 millones de dólares. Asimismo, la CRE ha publicado cerca de 100 regulaciones en materia de hidrocarburos y electricidad desde la entrada en vigor del nuevo marco legal. Esto contribuye a que exista un piso parejo para todos los competidores que día con día invierten en nuestro país. En suma, todas nuestras acciones como ente regulador y de los otros reguladores y autoridades aquí presentes han estado encaminadas a generar confianza, pero no únicamente entre los participantes del sector, sino a un nivel más general. En este punto quiero ser muy claro: el mayor reto de la reforma energética es contar con aceptación social y una base ciudadana que la respalde. Solo así es que la reforma será sostenible en el tiempo, y solo a través de esta confianza es que consolidaremos los resultados y escenarios planteados por el doctor Birol y la agencia. Estamos ante una reforma fundacional, pero que es silenciosa en este momento y que tiene que esperar a la larga maduración de los proyectos que ya están en curso. En consecuencia, debemos ganarnos la confianza de la ciudadanía todos los días y explicarles que este es un proceso arduo y de largo aliento. Claro, ello no significa que no se vaya a ver resultados ni beneficios concretos en el camino para las y los mexicanos. Por eso es tan relevante la visión del reporte que hoy se presenta, el cual contempla un horizonte hacia 2040 y que de manera notable identifica un México en el futuro con reforma y otro muy diferente sin ella. Por poner un ejemplo, de acuerdo con la agencia, el escenario con reforma aportaría casi un punto porcentual de crecimiento económico al año respecto al escenario sin reforma. Cuando uno compone este crecimiento a lo largo de los años, por eso se resulta en un país totalmente diferente con reforma que sin reforma. Quiero aprovechar esta ocasión también para destacar la estrecha colaboración que mantenemos con los organismos internacionales, en particular con la Organización para la Cooperación y el Desarrollo Económico, la OCDE. Estamos en este momento haciendo un ejercicio inédito con este organismo. Estamos haciendo una evaluación detallada del desempeño de la CRE, de la CNH y de la CEA. Este es un análisis que se va a hacer al interior de cada una de nuestras instituciones, pero también viéndonos en conjunto y la relación que tenemos con los inversionistas y con los propios reguladores, digamos, el policy maker, que es la Secretaría. La próxima semana en París se presentará la primera versión de esta evaluación. Estaremos presentes, estará presente la CRE, estará la CEA, estará la CNH, y de la colaboración con los entes internacionales seguramente se desprenderán muy buenas y apropiadas recomendaciones para todos nosotros. Señoras y señores, la reforma energética ubicó a México en el momento histórico que le correspondía. Es así que decidimos dar pasos firmes en la dirección correcta, mediante el fortalecimiento de los marcos de transparencia, rendición de cuentas y anticorrupción. La reforma y los instrumentos que de ella emanan están diseñados para generar confianza, como ya fui muy enfático en la plática, y asegurar así instituciones sólidas y con credibilidad, además de garantizar certeza jurídica para el despliegue de un entorno empresarial más atractivo. La agencia reconoce que en un mundo energético en pleno cambio, y un cambio que es a gran velocidad, México está siendo uno de los jugadores que se está moviendo más rápido. Esa es la primera frase del libro que van a ver, es esta con la que inicia el reporte. Con esto en mente, caminamos hacia un año más de implementación en 2017. Los retos no son menores, pero trabajamos día con día en el compromiso de que la reforma se traduzca en resultados tangibles, en beneficio de la sociedad, así como en la confianza ciudadana de largo plazo. Agradecemos nuevamente la distinción que la Agencia Internacional de Energía hace a nuestro país, ubicándonos con la presentación de este reporte en el centro del debate energético a nivel internacional en este año. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, comisionado presidente. Es así como llega al fin este evento. Agradecemos mucho su presencia.